Hi, Josh Taylor here with No Vital Records, No Problem, 15 ways to document vital events. Now, I'm probably describing something that has already happened to you as a genealogist or someone tracing their family tree. You're discovering that vital records don't always exist, and you're trying to figure out, what do I do? How do I find a maiden name without a marriage record? How do I document someone's birthday without a birth certificate? Well, these are questions that every genealogist encounters. And one of the reasons we encounter the question is because vital records are so important to what we do. So, for a brief recap, what are vital records anyway? Vital records are typically records created by a government entity, a government jurisdiction, that will document the date and location of a birth, marriage, or a death. They're important because sometimes a single document can link multiple generations. It can include the names of someone's father and mother. It might include the maiden name of a spouse. They also reveal information about occupations, about someone's religious affiliations, medical information, and other information that's important to us in our family history research. However, sometimes vital records cause us some problems. Don't panic, it's all going to be okay. Sometimes the records themselves were never created. Sometimes they were created late. Sometimes they might be inaccessible. Sometimes they might be unavailable because they were destroyed. Sometimes the records themselves are incomplete. For a father's name, we see don't know written rather than the actual name of someone's father. Sometimes people just have to guess when they're filling out a certificate. And so it's okay to not have the vital record. So here are 15 strategies for when that happens to you to make sure that you don't sweat it when you don't have the vital records for your family history research. The first strategy is to make sure that you're asking the right question. This is a mistake that I frequently made as a genealogist when I was first starting out, and I still make it now. It's that sometimes I'm asking the wrong question. Sometimes I think that finding a birth record, or if I could just find a death record, I'd solve the problem. Well, the truth is, we should make sure that we understand why we need that record in the first place. There are many other resources that can document someone's date of death, or document the relationship between a father and a son, or document a marriage. So why do we need the document in the first place? Making sure that we're asking the right question helps us to set a better research plan and work through a research strategy that actually accomplishes what we need to focus on. So number one, ask yourself, what is it you're hoping to obtain from that record? The second strategy is key because we have to determine what records actually exist. We could wish and hope for a marriage record from New York in 1830 from a town clerk, but guess what? It never existed in the first place. So it's not going to appear out of nowhere. This is where we should take time to determine what records actually might exist. This might be by looking at a record survey that was done that might have inventoried resources at a courthouse or at a local state or county archive. It might be looking online at resources like the FamilySearch Wiki. It also could be reaching out to a local genealogical society or a local genealogical organization, or even using social media such as Facebook and Twitter and other resources to interact with other researchers to ask them about records that exist for the particular place in which they're researching. The example that you're seeing on the screen is an inventory of Episcopal and Reformed Church records in America from the WPA that was done in the 1930s. This happens to be the inventory specifically for the Reformed Church in America in the New York City Church Archives area. Now, these records were in existence in 1939, so there's no guarantee they're still going to be around today, but it's an important step in determining what records might be available. The third strategy, the third step is to search for delayed registrations. Not every vital record is recorded immediately after the event occurs. Sometimes an event registration will be delayed for a number of reasons. A birth record might be delayed a number of years. Why? Well, it depends upon the purpose for which the record was created. Someone might have been applying for a passport when they were 35 years old and weren't able to have a copy of their birth record because birth certificates weren't around when they were born. And so they would submit an affidavit. They would have someone testify that they were in fact born on this date and give various pieces of information, and that might become part of a delayed registration. These types of registrations might exist for anything for individuals that wanted to work to prove identity, work for insurance purposes, if they were trying to gain citizenship in a particular country. Those are all types of events that might have brought these delayed registrations into existence. So it's important that you take some time to look through some of those delayed records if you're not finding what you need right away. Step number 4 is to broaden your search criteria. Sometimes as genealogists, we get so specific on the exact record that we need to find. I need to find the death record of this ancestor. What about the death record of one of their siblings that might have died 20 years later that could have information on it because the state or the particular jurisdiction was asking for more details? How can we broaden our search criteria to make sure that we're not being too specific in our search for vital records? Sometimes we need to broaden our search criteria to include other spellings or variations of names. These are all just examples of things that we can do to broaden our search criteria for vital records. Maybe we're looking in the wrong place. Maybe we're looking in the wrong time period. Again, don't get too caught up on some of the specifics when you're having a hard time finding some of these vital records. Step number 5 is to make sure that you're searching personal and family records. Now, I want to stop for just a moment and ask you to think about an ancestor that you might have had. Let's say they were born in 1820. Anywhere in the world born in 1820. How many times do you think that ancestor was asked to write down their birth date in their entire lifetime? Depends on where they were living and what they were doing. But the answer is probably less frequently than you write down your birth date now every day in different things that you fill out. Well, personal and family records remain an important element and an important resource that can capture some of this information. So it's key to make sure that you're searching personal and family records for some of these details. It could be family letters, it could be diaries, it could be other information that will help to document some of these vital events. Number 6, make sure that you're looking for substitute records such as religious records. Now, not every religion, not every denomination keeps a formal set of church records. This example is from a Baptist church in the early 1800s in Washington County, New York. Now, the church itself did not keep detailed lists of baptisms and marriages and burials, but on its membership list, guess what they did? They happened to record, you can see it in the blue, they happened to record vital events. They recorded the death of Nathaniel Clark in April of 1806 on the membership list. So there is one example of a vital record substitute that you can use through religious records. Other records you can use appear in strategy number 7, and that is to search newspapers. Now, this doesn't work for every place and every time period, but newspapers can be important clues. In this example, we see the death notice in Freeport, Illinois in August of 1878 for a Mrs. Zelpha Clark, the mother of Mrs. George A. Stiles. Now, this particular record, it isn't as good as a death certificate. There's no parents' names, there's no place of birth, but it's as good as we're going to get to document this specific event. So make sure that you spent time to search for newspapers. And remember, sometimes a newspaper reporting a vital event might not be as detailed. So the birth of children at someone's home, for example, might only congratulate Mr. and Mrs. Smith for the birth of their daughter. It won't list the daughter's name. It might not even list the full name of the father or of the mother. So it takes some time to look through those newspapers to see what you can find that might document vital events. Other record substitutes and things that can help you document birth and marriage and death dates are burial and funeral records. Again, these don't exist for every place, for every time period, but they can be important components. The record of someone's funeral can include details about their date of death, the date of the funeral, and other resources that were gathered at the time that they passed away. It could have their birth date. It might have a list of every single relative that was in attendance or every single relative that they could identify as they were gathering items to write an obituary or a death notice. They could have details about the services, details about education and military service. So make sure that you spend some time examining burial and funeral records as part of your quest for birth, marriage, and death information. Number 9, and this is also an important one because it takes on exploring probate and estate records. Now, again, not all these strategies will work for every ancestor in every single location, but probate and estate records are especially key because they help us to link relationships. If someone happened to leave a will, what they wrote in their will, who they gave certain items to, how they divided their estate can be very important. Land can be important, items, jewelry, objects, books, all of the division of an estate. When someone makes a decision and they clarify relationships, I give to my loving wife, I give to my daughter, I give to my granddaughter, I give to my niece, my nephew, my cousin. Be careful with cousin, because cousin can mean a lot of different relationships. But make sure that you spent time to examine the will of an ancestor if you're lucky enough to find an ancestor who left a will. But also, search the wills of other relatives of your ancestor. You never know when you'll find mentions of siblings and cousins and in-laws and all sorts of things within a will. Now, next to that, if someone happened to die without a will, in a lot of places, they would go through an intestate process, which meant that the court would have to have an administrator for the estate as they start to distribute things. So in the example that you see on the left, you see the will of Nathan Wade, which names his daughters and his wife. On the right, you see the inventory of Charles Megan. Now, this is an example of someone that died without a will, and so there was a full inventory of the estate taken, and then those items, we assume, were distributed to members of the family. The catch here is that the county that Charles Megan died in had a courthouse fire in 1910 that destroyed the majority of the early probate records. So this is the only surviving page from his estate document. It doesn't give a date of death. In fact, the only relative that it mentions is that a true inventory of the property was returned by Sarah Megan. Now, I know through other research that he had a wife named Sarah. So I'm drawing the conclusion here, it's reasonable to assume that Sarah Megan is in fact his wife or his widow at this point, Sarah Megan. I would want to do some further research to verify that. But this is what I have to document his death and to document his estate. I'm not going to go crazy looking for other information if the records weren't simply created in the first place. Other record substitutes brings us to strategy number 10, and that is to search military records. For those relatives that are on your family tree that served in various conflicts and various branches of the military for whatever country they're from or state or region, military records can be incredibly helpful to use as vital record substitutes. Everything from a service record that might list a more precise birth location to a pension record where someone is applying for support and having to provide details about their life. In the example you see here on the screen, this is from the pension file from the US Civil War of John W. Shoup. Now, John W. Shoup died in 1892 in Nebraska, before Nebraska kept formal vital records. So when I wrote to the state for a death certificate, they told me he wouldn't have one because they didn't start keeping those certificates until 1904. However, when his widow applied for a pension, his widow had to provide information first about their marriage. So there's a copy of a marriage record in the pension file. And second, because she couldn't get a copy of a death certificate, she had to provide affidavits around his death. And so this affidavit is actually signed by John's daughter and his son-in-law and gives information that talks about the circumstances when he passed away. That is as close to a death certificate as I'm going to find in this particular instance. But it gives me the place, it gives me the time, it gives me the date, and it gives me the circumstances. That's the type of information that I need to verify that particular part of his life. And speaking of lives, this leads me to strategy number 11, which is to consider a person's entire lifetime. We earlier explored, the idea of how many times someone might write down their birth date in their lifetime if they were born in, say, 1820. Well, consider that across an entire lifetime and all of the other elements of someone's life that can give you clues that are not just a birth, marriage, or a death date. Those are 3 important dates in our family trees, but there's so many other dates. There's college graduation dates, There's date states. There's all sorts of things that might exist that you need to make sure that we're finding records for. There's dates when they sold property. There's dates when they moved from one place to the next. There's dates when they're recorded in a census. These are all examples of things that we should look at when we're considering someone's entire lifetime. The next strategy expands on the idea of considering someone's lifetime, but also looking outside an immediate family member. It's very possible that the celebration of someone's birth, of their marriage, or even remembrance when someone passed away is also found in materials that document the stories of friends, associates, neighbors, cousins, aunts and uncles, and other relatives. So make sure that you're spending some time looking for vital events and other resources outside of that immediate family. It might be a diary entry from a cousin that notes a letter they received that had information about the upcoming marriage of your ancestor that gives you that important clue. Strategy 13 is to examine patterns. Genealogists should spend more time examining patterns when they're trying to look for vital information, particularly looking for birth, marriage, and deaths. Now, what do I mean by looking at patterns? Well, patterns can include everything from a series of unrecorded events. If vital records were in fact in existence in the place where a family lived, but your family doesn't appear in any of those vital records, you should ask yourself why and begin to trace and question the pattern itself. If events are continuously unrecorded, there might be a reason for that. Maybe they're recorded differently. At the same time, looking for the appearances of a family within a particular record can be key. How did someone in the town tell two men apart who had the same name? Those are patterns you might begin to pick up in some of these records. Oftentimes we miss vital records because of movements and because of migrations. Our ancestors didn't settle in a brand new territory and run to the courthouse immediately to register the birth of their child. They might have had to clear land to build the courthouse to register that vital event itself, if it was even part of the law. And so this is where we have to examine patterns and be very, very realistic about what's available and the options that we can use and various interactions our relatives might have had. So this is what I mean by examining patterns in our relatives' lives as we're looking at some of these vital events. It might be that there was a couple who happened to not have the name of any of their children when they wrote a birth certificate out or filled out that information. And so all of them are baby Smith or child Smith or male Smith. Those are all possibilities and might be a pattern that you notice within a specific family. So strategy number 14, and this is something that can be hard to do, but it's so important to get right, and that is to make an educated guess. If you've done your homework and you've done all that you can do to try and find a vital record, it's okay to make an educated guess about how old would that person have been when they were married. Maybe you have an educated guess based upon a series of census records. Make an educated guess and this is important, make sure that you state it's an educated guess when you share that information in online family trees and when you share that information with others. Make sure the about and calculated and other important details beyond that year carry through. Otherwise, someone might assume that you know a year from a document when in fact, all you've done is made an educated guess. And that's okay because it's part of doing our research. We're not going to find the full day, month, and year for every birth, marriage, and death in our family tree. If you can, it would be an absolute miracle. What we can do is do a reasonable, exhaustive search and make an educated and appropriate guess as needed. And this leads me to the 15th and the final strategy, and that is to document and share your results. You might not be able to find a birth record, but you might be able to write an article that explains why you believe an ancestor had a specific birth date or a specific birth year. Document and share the experiences and the results that you had in trying to find that vital record. An article for your family, an article online, a peer-reviewed article for the Scholarly Genealogical Journal. These are all possibilities of things that you can create. Maybe you'll add it to an online family tree with proper documentation and explaining why you can't find that vital event. Sometimes social media can be used to disseminate that information. So in review, it's okay. Alternatives do exist to birth, marriage, and death records. In many situations, there may not be a record of a birth, marriage, or a death. It might never have been written down, and that's okay. Use these tips together. Use them collectively. Don't just pick one or two. Make sure that you conduct that reasonable, exhaustive search, and then document and write down that search experience. So in conclusion, sometimes vital records were never created. Sometimes they're simply not accessible. Sometimes they're not available. And sometimes, even when you have them, they're incomplete. But that's okay, because now you have 15 ways to document vital events, making no vital records no longer a problem for you in your family history research. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you enjoy and take some of these tips back to others and share them. And also make sure that you take advantage of the many other opportunities and videos that are part of this year's RootsTech Connect event.